Hey guys, today I, Hadyn,
Biola, and Trevor
are going to talk about the complex subject of pedigree analysis.
There are many things to consider when reading a pedigree, such as the symbols used and their specific meanings, the modes of inheritance from parent to child, and the statistical probability that an offspring will inherit or express a given trait.
Before we begin our discussion of pedigrees, it is important to understand the basics. A square and a circle are used to designate male and female respectively. A diamond shape can also be used in the unlikely event that the sex of a person in the pedigree is unknown. An empty square, circle, or diamond shows that the individual is not affected by the trait in question, while a fully colored symbol designates an affected individual. If the symbol displays a colored circle in the center, then the individual is a carrier who carries the recessive gene but does not display the trait. If the symbol is crossed diagonally by a line through the center, then the individual is deceased. If the symbol has a question mark, then the state of the individual is unknown. Couples are connected by a single horizontal line, with their offspring branched beneath them in birth order. The first type of inheritance we will discuss today is autosomal recessive. Autosomal recessive traits appear equivalently in both males and females, but only affect an individual if they inherit two alleles for the trait, one from each parent. If the trait is rare, most parents of affected progeny are heterozygous and unaffected. This causes the trait to appear as if it skips generations. If both parents are heterozygous, 1/4 of their offspring are likely to display the trait. When both parents are affected by an autosomal recessive trait, all the offspring will be affected. If an affected individual mates with an unaffected and homozygous dominant person, all of their children will be heterozygous and therefore carriers, but none will display the trait. This is why a recessive trait is more likely to appear in a pedigree when two people within the same family mate, because there is a greater chance of both parents carrying the same recessive allele. An example of an autosomal recessive inheritance pattern is for a disease called cystic fibrosis. Both parents in this situation are carriers. Each of their children has a 1 in 4 chance of being affected by the disease, such as this child right here. Their children have a 2 in 4 chance of being carriers like them. Their children also have a 1 in 4 chance of not being affected at all. Just like autosomal recessive traits, autosomal dominant traits appear in both sexes with equal frequency. Autosomal dominant traits do not skip generations, since each person with a dominant trait inherited the allele from at least one parent. When an autosomal dominant allele is uncommon, most people displaying the trait will be heterozygous. If a single parent is affected and heterozygous and the other parent is unaffected, half of their offspring will be affected. But if both parents are heterozygous, 3/4 of their progeny will be affected. In the rare chance that one parent is affected and homozygous and the other is unaffected, all offspring will be affected. An example of autosomal dominant inheritance pattern is Marfan syndrome. The condition is inherited in an autosomal dominant pattern, which means one copy of the altered gene in each cell is sufficient to cause the disorder. Both parents in this situation are heterozygous and affected. 3/4 of their progeny have a 50% chance of being affected.
Y-linked traits. In a pedigree, Y-linked traits are generally very easy to spot. Since Y-linked traits are the result of differences in the Y chromosome, they only appear in males. Additionally, such traits do not skip generations. In terms of calculating probability of inheriting a Y-linked trait, it is important to note that 100% of the male offspring of an affected male will be affected by this trait. Mitochondrial inheritance. In some cases, it seems as if none of the aforementioned modes of inheritance apply to what is seen in the pedigree. In such a case, the trait may be inherited from a mutation in the mitochondrial DNA. According to the law of replicative segregation, mitochondria undergo division that is independent of the cell cycle and are separated randomly during cellular mitosis. Since cells do not make an attempt to put equal numbers of mitochondria into each daughter cell, differences between mitochondria are not passed on equally. Mutations in mitochondrial DNA are received only from the mother because sperm do not contribute any mitochondria to the zygote. Thus, traits inherited from mutated mtDNA are only passed from mother to offspring. Additionally, an individual may be heteroplasmic for a mitochondrial trait, meaning that their cells have some wild-type mitochondria and some with mutated DNA. The ratio of wild-type to mutated mtDNA determines the phenotype of the individual. If a mother is heteroplasmic, which is more likely than homoplasmic recessive, the mitochondrial genotype of her offspring is somewhat random. In a pedigree, traits inherited from mutated mtDNA can be identified by the fact that they are inherited only from the mother. This means an affected male is unable to pass on the mutation. Unfortunately, due to the somewhat random nature of replicative segregation, a heteroplasmic mother may produce all mutated offspring, some mutated and some normal, or all normal offspring. Also, a mother that displays the wild-type phenotype may still pass on a mutated trait to her offspring if she is heteroplasmic. Since the division and separation of mitochondria is random within a cell, there is no reliable way to calculate the probability of inheritance within a pedigree. The chance that a female's offspring will inherit a particular trait coded for by mtDNA is dependent on the ratio of wild-type and mutated mitochondria in her cells.
X-linked traits are unique because they are expressed in the X chromosome. In an X-linked recessive pedigree, traits appear more frequently in males than in females because males need to inherit only a single copy of the allele to display the trait, whereas females must inherit 2 copies of the allele, one from each parent, to be affected. Since a male inherits his X chromosome from his mother, affected males are usually born to unaffected mothers who carry an allele for the trait. It tends to skip generations since the trait is passed from unaffected female to affected males to unaffected females. X-linked recessive traits cannot be passed from father to son because the son only inherits his father's Y chromosome. All daughters of an affected father will be carriers. If a woman is a carrier for X-linked recessive traits, and the father is not a carrier for this trait, then there's a chance the boy will be born either healthy or affected. For a girl, there's a possibility that the girl will be born healthy or as a carrier for the trait. In another scenario, if the woman is born as a carrier and the husband was affected with the trait, then there's a possibility that the boy would be born healthy or born affected with the trait. And as for the girl, there's a possibility that the girl might be born as a carrier or be infected with the disease. An example of an X-linked recessive trait would be red-green color blindness, a form of color blindness in which red and green are perceived as identical. For an X-linked dominant trait, both males and females need to inherit only a single copy of the allele on the X chromosome to display the trait. In an X-linked dominant pedigree, traits appear more frequently in females than in males. A female inherits an X chromosome from both her mother and her father, so females can receive an X-linked dominant trait from either parent. Since a male only inherits one X chromosome from his mother, he can only receive an X-linked dominant trait from his mother. An affected male must have an affected mother. Each person with an X-linked dominant trait must also have an affected parent, which means that X-linked dominant traits do not skip generations. Affected men pass the trait to all of their daughters and none to their son. If the father has a son, he will not pass on the X chromosome, but rather the Y chromosome, which means his son will have not inherited the trait from his father. If a female has an X-linked dominant trait, there is a 50% chance that both son and daughter will have inherited the trait, but there's also a 50% chance that both son and daughter will have not been infected by the trait. An example of an X-linked dominant trait is Rett syndrome, which is a rare genetic mutation affecting development in girls.
Now let's walk through an example pedigree and see if we can determine what mode of inheritance dictates this trait. The British royal family has a long and well-documented history of hemophilia. Looking at the pedigree, the first thing that should jump out to you is that only males express this trait in their phenotype. Additionally, there are no females affected by hemophilia, but some are carriers for the trait. The fact that this trait is only expressed in one sex should immediately suggest to you that this is an X-linked trait. If it were autosomal, we would expect it to be expressed somewhat equally in both males and females. Even though only males in the royal family have hemophilia, it cannot be Y-linked because females can be carriers for the condition. Now the question remains, is hemophilia X-linked dominant or recessive? This can also be answered by looking at the difference in how it is expressed in males and females. If it were X-linked dominant, there would be no carriers of the trait. All females who have the allele coding for hemophilia would have the condition if it were dominant. Thus, hemophilia must be an X-linked recessive trait. This can be further supported if you think about sex chromosomes. Males have one X and one Y chromosome, whereas females have two X chromosomes. If a male inherits one copy of the allele coding for hemophilia from his mother, he's guaranteed to have the condition because he has only one copy of the X chromosome. On the other hand, if a female inherits a single copy of hemophilia from her mother or her father, she will not have the condition because she still has a wild-type copy of that allele.